Welcome to the silent empires, where power doesn't announce itself, and every story lingers in the shadows. Here, there are no interruptions, no distractions, just raw, uninterrupted storytelling for those who understand what moves beneath the surface. If this story drew you in, if you felt even a quiet connection to it, take a second to like the video. And in the comments, share something simple but meaningful. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I want to see how far this reaches, and who's here with me in this exact moment. The man on the witness stand in a New York federal courtroom looked nothing like the image that had once haunted law enforcement files. No expensive suit, no entourage waiting outside the courthouse doors, no hint of the quiet power that had moved money and men across city boroughs for years. Under the bright courtroom lights, Michael "Mikey" DiLeonardo raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and began describing a world that was never supposed to be spoken of in public. Prosecutors leaned in, defense attorneys bristled, and reporters scribbled his every word. For decades, the organization he belonged to had ruled parts of New York from the shadows, fixing construction contracts, steering union decisions, and settling disputes outside the law. On this day, one of its former rising stars was breaking a code of silence that had defined generations of men before him. Outside that courtroom, the mythology of organized crime still lingered. The tailored suits, the neighborhood respect, the whispered stories of men who took care of things when regular channels failed. But on the stand, the reality sounded far more mundane and far more corrosive. It was about small decisions that accumulated over time. Who you stood next to on a street corner, where you spent your evenings, which uncles and cousins you listened to. It was about a young man from a working-class Brooklyn family who slowly, almost invisibly, moved from the sidewalk outside the social club to a seat at the table inside. To understand how Michael DiLeonardo arrived at that witness stand, caught between his past loyalties and his new role as a government witness, we have to go back decades, to a very different New York, and to the neighborhood streets that shaped him. Michael DiLeonardo was born in 1955 into a world that was still finding its footing after the Second World War. His parents were part of a wave of Italian Americans who had clawed their way out of tenement poverty into modest stability. Their Brooklyn neighborhood, densely packed, overwhelmingly Italian and deeply Catholic, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, for better or worse. Names mattered. Who your father was, who your uncles were, where your family came from in Italy. These details followed you into school, into church, and onto the corners where boys gathered in the late afternoon. Respect for elders was not a suggestion. It was an expectation. So was loyalty to family, sometimes defined narrowly as blood relatives, and sometimes extended to men who were not related by blood but who held unquestioned authority. The streets themselves were an education. In the post-war years, the Italian-American strongholds of Brooklyn became home turf for members of New York's Cosa Nostra families. The Gambinos, the Genoveses, the Colombos, the Lucases, and the Bananos all had footprints in neighborhoods like the one where DiLeonardo grew up. Their presence was not always obvious in the sense of open violence or public confrontations. Instead, it was felt in subtler ways. In the men who seemed to do no visible work yet always had cash. In the way certain arguments in the neighborhood were settled quietly and decisively. In the fact that some storefronts, social clubs with shades half drawn and a steady procession of older men playing cards, were never disturbed by the police. As a child, Michael would have walked past these places without yet fully understanding what they represented. Only that older boys and cautious parents spoke of them with a mix of fear, resentment, and admiration. Inside the home, life looked like that of many second-generation immigrant families. His parents placed value on work and order. The father left early for a blue-collar job, part of the vast army of labor that kept New York's infrastructure, shipping, and construction moving. The mother managed the household, keeping the children in line, making sure they attended school and church, reinforcing the idea that the family was a unit that moved together through good times and bad. Yet even in these disciplined households, the outside world exerted a powerful pull. The gap between what a hardworking man could earn legally and what some neighbors seemed to have, better cars, nicer clothes, thicker envelopes of cash at weddings and funerals, did not go unnoticed by the younger generation growing up in the shadow of both legitimate striving and illicit success. By the time DiLeonardo was entering his teenage years in the 1960s, New York was shifting. The optimism of the 1950s gave way to turbulence, civil rights struggles, anti-war protests, and a rising crime rate that left working-class communities feeling vulnerable and ignored. In these neighborhoods, many families still held tight to traditional values, positioning themselves as separate from the upheaval playing out on television screens. For young men like Michael, the path offered by their parents' school, a trade, long hours for modest pay, competed with what they saw on their own streets. There was no need to romanticize it with movie images. The real-life examples were right there. Men connected to organized crime appeared insulated from the city's anxiety. They walked the streets as if the rules did not apply to them in quite the same way. In later interviews, DiLeonardo would describe this environment less as a dramatic crossroads and more as a gradual normalization. The men known to be with one of the families were not distant villains. They were godfathers at baptisms, relatives seen at weddings, neighbors who handed out money for ice cream to kids on a hot day. For a boy growing up there, the distinction between respectable community figure and criminal actor could be very blurry. Parents might warn against getting too close, yet those same parents sometimes accepted favors or quietly appreciated the protection such men seemed to offer when local merchants were robbed or when disputes threatened to spiral. This atmosphere of mixed messages created fertile ground for attraction to that world, even if no one would have put it in those terms at the time. Michael's adolescence unfolded alongside the early cracks forming in the mythology of invincible organized crime. In 1963, former mob insider Joseph Valachi's testimony before a Senate committee exposed the existence of a national criminal organization to the public in unprecedented detail. Newspapers ran diagrams of the 5 families, and television reports spoke of bosses, underbosses, and captains. Yet in neighborhoods like Michael's, little changed day to day. The social clubs still operated, card games still ran late into the night, and men in expensive overcoats still emerged from unmarked doors to stroll down the block. The government's revelations confirmed what many in these zip codes had always suspected, but the institutions charged with dismantling that Underworld seemed distant from the daily realities of kids playing stickball under tenement windows. As he moved into his late teens, DiLeonardo's world widened but remained anchored in the same cultural space. Like many young men around him, he gravitated toward jobs that did not require a college degree but promised steady work. Construction, trucking, the docks, and city maintenance crews were common destinations. These industries, especially construction and certain unions, had long histories of infiltration by organized crime families, who saw in them opportunities for influence and illicit profit. A young worker in these fields might never personally commit a serious offense, yet still find himself rubbing shoulders with individuals whose primary allegiance was to a criminal hierarchy. It was in this gray zone, where legitimate labor and illicit control intersected, that Michael's path began to diverge from that of an ordinary working-class kid. The family and social network surrounding him played an important role in that shift. In the insular Italian-American communities of mid-century New York, marriages often linked not just 2 individuals but 2 extended clans, each with their own histories and connections. In his 20s, DiLeonardo married into a family with deep ties to one of the most powerful figures in the Gambino crime family, Aniello Neil Delacroce. Delacroce, a feared and respected underboss under Carlo Gambino and later Paul Castellano, represented the old guard, hard-line wing of the organization. Through this marriage, Michael was no longer just a kid from the neighborhood who knew some connected guys. He became a relative by marriage of someone at the very pinnacle of that hidden world. This change in status did not automatically transform him into a prominent mob figure, but it altered the atmosphere around him. Family gatherings, holiday dinners, and social occasions now sometimes included men whose names were whispered in law enforcement offices and printed on confidential reports. According to DiLeonardo's later accounts, his first meaningful interactions with high-level Gambino figures did not happen in smoky backrooms but at those family functions, where the line between ordinary domestic life and underworld power structures blurred. To outside observers, the events might have looked like any other large Italian-American celebration. Tables crowded with food, children running between chairs, older men exchanging greetings. But to someone within that circle, it was impossible to miss who commanded deference when they entered a room. During this time, Staten Island was emerging as a suburban refuge for many families leaving older Brooklyn neighborhoods, and it became a key setting in Michael's evolving life. The Verrazano Narrows Bridge, opened in the mid-1960s, had made it easier for Brooklyn residents to relocate there while keeping their jobs and social connections. By moving to Staten Island, DiLeonardo and his young family joined a migration that quietly reshaped the geography of New York's underworld. Many mid- and upper-level figures in the Gambino family settled in Staten Island's growing Italian-American enclaves, where they could live in single-family homes with yards while still operating close to their centers of power in Brooklyn and Manhattan. Michael found himself living and socializing in a borough that increasingly doubled as a residential base for the very organization he was orbiting. From the outside, he still appeared to be progressing through a relatively conventional life course: marriage, children, work in the construction and contracting world. Yet construction in New York City during the 1970s and 1980s was not merely a neutral industry. It was one of the primary engines through which the major crime families exerted influence and extracted profits, controlling which companies received contracts, which unions dominated particular sites, and how much off the books money changed hands. For an ambitious man with the right connections, this environment offered an unusual combination of legitimate and illegitimate opportunity. You could own or manage a real business, employ real workers, and build actual structures, while simultaneously advancing in a criminal organization that used those businesses as tools in a larger enterprise. As his family ties and daily work brought him into closer contact with Gambino associates, DiLeonardo's role began to shift from that of a bystander to that of an associate, still not a formally initiated member, but recognized as a reliable earner and loyal to a particular faction. This status, common in Cosa Nostra families, functioned as both a test and an apprenticeship. Associates handled tasks that might range from the mundane to the clearly illegal, collecting payments, introducing businessmen to the right contacts, ensuring that union votes went the way certain powerful men wanted them to. For law enforcement, the associate layer was often hard to penetrate, because on paper these individuals often looked like ordinary businessmen, union officials, or foremen. For someone like Michael, it offered a chance to prove himself useful to men at the top while preserving a surface appearance of legitimacy. The tension between those two identities, respectable family man and underworld associate, ran through his early adulthood. At home, he was a husband and father, living in a borough full of similar families, attending school plays and family events. Among friends and relatives, he was known as smart, personable, and able to move comfortably in social settings. In business, he was involved in ventures that could plausibly be presented as entirely above board. But the decisions he was making, who he aligned with in disputes, whose directions he followed, what kind of money he agreed to move or collect, were increasingly binding him to the Gambino family's internal structure. The code of silence, or omerta, was not something explained to him in a single dramatic conversation. It was a set of expectations absorbed gradually from watching how others behaved and what happened to those who failed to conform. The broader context of New York's organized crime world in the late 1970s and early 1980s also shaped the space in which DiLeonardo operated. Within the Gambino family, tensions simmered between the conservative faction aligned with underboss Aniello Delacroce and the more business-oriented leadership of boss Paul Castellano, who had succeeded Carlo Gambino in the mid-1970s. These internal rifts would eventually explode into open conflict, culminating in the infamous 1985 assassination of Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse, a turning point that helped elevate John Gotti to the top. For a young associate linked by marriage to Delacroce's side of the organization, these divisions were not just gossip. They determined alliances, opportunities, and risks. Even before the violence erupted, the lines were being drawn in ways that affected who promoted whom, who was trusted with sensitive information, and which new faces were allowed to rise. Within this environment, DiLeonardo's reputation for reliability and his powerful family ties combined to make him a valuable asset to the faction that would come to surround John Gotti. The men who would later dominate New York tabloid headlines in the late 1980s and early 1990s first knew Michael not as a headline-making defector, but as a younger relative and associate who could be counted on to help manage the complex mix of legitimate-looking business and criminal undertakings that kept the organization functioning. The groundwork for his later elevation within the Gambino ranks was being laid in these years, not through spectacular acts of violence or daring crimes. Those were the images that would dominate public imagination, but through the quieter, more persistent tasks of building relationships, handling money, and proving consistency. Yet even in these earlier stages, the costs of such a path were already visible, especially to those willing to look closely. The same neighborhoods that benefited from the occasional favor, a debt forgiven, a problem fixed, also bore the burden of economic distortion, corruption, and fear. Businesses paid more than they should have for contracts or protection. Honest contractors struggled to compete with those blessed by mob connections, and union members found their collective power bent toward the interests of a few criminal figures rather than the rank and file. In later testimony, when DiLeonardo walked juries through the mechanisms of these schemes, what emerged was not a story of glamorous outlawry, but of systematic manipulation and quiet coercion that reached into boardrooms as much as back alleys. For the young man still earning his place, however, the daily reality was far less grandiose than the legends that would later attach to names like Gotti and Gravano. It was long hours, constant phone calls, meetings in diners and offices, and a web of obligations that grew more complex with each favor granted or received. Every introduction to a businessman seeking help from the Gambinos, every envelope passed, every problem resolved outside legal channels, pulled him a little further from the path his parents might have imagined for him, and a little deeper into a life where exit would one day come at a crushing cost. Long before he took the witness stand and described this world under oath, Michael "Mikey" Scars DiLeonardo was already making the choices that would eventually leave him with only two options: remain silent and loyal to a crumbling code, or speak openly about the life that had defined him from those early Brooklyn days forward. By the early 1980s, the quiet progression that had taken Michael DiLeonardo from neighborhood kid to trusted associate was starting to intersect with fault lines running through the very top of the organization he served. Inside the Gambino family, resentments that had been simmering for years were hardening into factions. On one side stood Paul Castellano, the boss who had inherited the empire after Carlo Gambino's death in 1976, a man who favored business like operations, white-collar schemes, and distance from the street. On the other was Aniello Neil Delacroce, the underboss living in modest quarters above a Little Italy social club, representing the older, more traditional wing of Cosa Nostra, men who believed that status should come from years of street work, not from corporate-style maneuvering. Through marriage and personal loyalty, DiLeonardo was firmly rooted in Delacroce's camp. The divide was not academic. It shaped who trusted whom, whose calls got returned, and where new money flowed. Michael, still an associate without his formal induction, found himself working and socializing within the orbit of Delacroce loyalists. Among them was a charismatic Queens-born capo named John Gotti, whose crew had been rising in profile since the late 1970s. Gotti and the men around him, Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano, Frank DeSicco, and others, believed Castellano was distancing himself from the rank-and-file soldiers and associates who generated much of the family's income and risk. For ambitious younger men like DiLeonardo, whose credibility rested on his Delacroce connection and his usefulness in construction and union matters, the growing influence of Gotti's faction opened new paths upward. At the same time, pressure from law enforcement was intensifying across New York. The federal racketeering statute known as RICO, enacted in 1970, had finally come into its own as a weapon against organized crime. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, federal prosecutors methodically built cases using surveillance, informants, and financial records rather than relying solely on eyewitnesses to isolated crimes. High-profile cases, like the so-called commission trial that targeted the leadership of several New York families, demonstrated that entire hierarchies could be sent to prison for long stretches based on patterns of activity rather than any single incident. For the Gambinos, it was a warning shot that the old ways of staying insulated, having the boss stand at a distance from day-to-day operations, might no longer guarantee safety. Inside this shifting landscape, Michael's work in and around the construction industry became increasingly valuable. New York's building boom offered countless opportunities for those willing to bend rules, steering contracts, controlling which companies could pour concrete or deliver materials, and extracting illegal payments from developers who wanted their projects to move without labor disruptions. DiLeonardo's background as a seemingly legitimate businessman, combined with his access to Gambino decision-makers, made him an effective bridge between underworld expectations and the surface world of contracts, permits, and job sites. Prosecutors would later describe how men like him used their influence over certain unions and construction firms to ensure that projects of significant size rarely moved forward in key parts of the city without quiet approval from one or more crime families. While he rose in this hidden economy, developments at the top of the Gambino family raced toward a crisis. In 1985, Delacroce, long plagued by illness, succumbed to cancer. His death removed a stabilizing figure who had, for years, discouraged open revolt against Castellano despite his own disagreements with the boss's style. For the loyals who had gathered around Delacroce's table, including many of the men who would later promote Michael's career, it felt like the loss of both a leader and a protective shield. Castellano's decision not to attend Delacroce's wake was read by many in that camp as a final insult, underscoring how deep the divide had grown. Just months later, in December 1985, Castellano and his driver were gunned down outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, a killing that stunned both law enforcement and the underworld. John Gotti swiftly emerged as the primary suspect in orchestrating the hit, though he would never be convicted for that murder. Within days, he asserted himself as the new boss of the Gambino family, gathering support from men who believed he spoke for those who had felt sidelined during the Castellano years. For someone in DiLeonardo's position, aligned with Delacroce's world, already active in construction, and known to Gotti's circle, This power shift drastically reoriented the family's internal map. Under Gotti, the Gambinos entered the most publicly visible era in their history. The new boss cultivated an image of flamboyant defiance, expensive suits, high-profile appearances at Manhattan night spots, and a willingness to be photographed and quoted by the tabloids. As Gotti's reputation as the Teflon Don grew, thanks to his early acquittals in major federal cases, so did public fascination with the organization he led. For law enforcement, that visibility was both a curse and a gift. On one hand, it lent the mafia an aura of glamour in the public imagination that agents and prosecutors found deeply misleading. On the other, the attention fueled political will for aggressive prosecutions and unlocked new resources for long-term investigations. Behind the spectacle, the day-to-day work of running a criminal organization depended on men like Michael DiLeonardo more than on the boss's appearances in the press. Gotti needed reliable figures to maintain and expand the family's income streams while he managed internal politics and legal threats. The construction sector, still one of the family's most important revenue sources, was a priority. Underboss Sammy Gravano, who had himself made significant money in construction and development, was tasked with overseeing many of those operations. Gravano's crew, and those aligned with it, became a hub for ambitious associates who understood both blueprints and the unspoken rules of Cosa Nostra. DiLeonardo fit that profile, and over time he moved closer to the center of gravity within this network. By the late 1980s, after years of earning, obeying, and keeping his head down when necessary, Michael reached a turning point that separated casual associates from those fully bound to the organization. Around 1988, during John Gotti's reign, he was formally inducted as a made man in the Gambino family. The ceremony itself, held behind closed doors and shielded from cameras, followed rituals that had been passed down for generations. A vow of loyalty, a pricked finger, a religious image, and an oath that placed allegiance to the family above all other ties. The FBI had secretly recorded a similar ceremony in a different family around that time, and those tapes, later played in court, gave the public a rare glimpse into a process that men like DiLeonardo described under oath years later. For him, induction was both a reward for years of service and a point of no return. The promotion changed his formal responsibilities and his informal standing overnight. As a soldier in the Gambino family, he no longer worked only through intermediaries. He represented the family in his own right, with his own small crew of associates who answered to him. In practice, that meant deeper involvement in the construction and union activities he already knew well. He became a recognizable figure among certain contractors, union representatives, and business owners who understood that dealing with him meant dealing with the Gambinos. Some of these relationships stayed entirely within the realm of subtle pressure, a reminder that hiring a particular trucking company would be good for business, or that using union labor from a certain hall would help ensure a smooth job. Others, as federal indictments would later outline, crossed clear legal lines in the form of extortion, bid rigging, and systematic skimming from major projects. Money flowed both ways. From the bottom up, associates and business partners delivered cash and favors to DiLeonardo and other soldiers, who then passed portions upward to their captains, and ultimately to the administration around Gotti. This tribute system ensured that those at the top shared in the profits generated on the street, while those below could claim the protection and authority that came from being linked, however indirectly, to the boss himself. The amounts involved were not always enormous in any single transaction. Sometimes it was a few $1,000s from a job, sometimes more. But over years, they added up to a significant shadow economy layered atop New York's legitimate one. Through all of this, Michael's life outside the underworld maintained a veneer of normality. He continued to live on Staten Island, in neighborhoods where many residents had similar backgrounds, and where the presence of mob-linked figures was more often accepted as a fact of life than discussed openly. To neighbors, he was a family man, a businessman who dressed well and seemed to be doing better than many of his peers. He attended family events, looked after his children, and moved in circles that included both entirely legitimate professionals and men whose names would later appear in indictment papers. This dual existence was not unique to him. It was a hallmark of the generation of Cosa Nostra figures who came of age in the 1970s and 1980s, blending into suburban life even as they played roles in a long-standing criminal network. Meanwhile, the legal environment around him continued to tighten. Federal agents devoted years to surveilling the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club and the Rave Night Social Club, Gotti's headquarters in Queens and Manhattan, planting microphones in walls and light fixtures, recording countless hours of conversations among Gambino members. Though not every conversation led directly to charges, the cumulative effect was to give prosecutors a more complete map of relationships and responsibilities than they had ever possessed before. When they listened to references to construction jobs, union votes, or our friends in a particular company, names like Michael DiLeonardo appeared in their notes, even if he was not yet the primary target. The early 1990s brought a dramatic escalation. In 1992, after a trial built on secretly recorded conversations and the testimony of former underboss Sammy Gravano, who had himself broken the code of silence and become a government witness, John Gotti was convicted of murder and racketeering and sentenced to life in prison. For the Gambino family, it was a seismic event. Their once untouchable boss was now serving a life sentence in a federal penitentiary, and the myth of invincibility around the organization took a serious hit. Yet the structure did not collapse. Instead, leadership adjusted. Gotti maintained symbolic control from behind bars, while trusted figures on the street managed day-to-day operations. In this period of transition, men who had proven themselves capable and loyal, like DiLeonardo, became even more vital. With the former underboss cooperating and the boss imprisoned, the family needed people who could be counted on to keep money flowing and to maintain discipline without drawing unnecessary attention. Michael's combination of low-key demeanor, business experience, and deep family ties made him a natural candidate for greater authority. Over time, he was elevated to the role of capo, or captain, a mid-level leadership position overseeing a crew of soldiers and associates operating in Brooklyn, Staten Island, and parts of Manhattan. In that role, he coordinated multiple income streams, mediated disputes, and attended meetings where wider family strategy was discussed. As he climbed, the disconnect between public perception and internal reality grew wider. To many outside observers, the Gotti conviction, along with similar blows to other families, suggested that organized crime in New York was a fading force, something from another era, now finally being brought under control by aggressive law enforcement. Inside the Gambino family, however, the attitude was more nuanced. They adjusted tactics, spoke more carefully, and became more cautious about where and how they met, but they did not regard themselves as finished. Construction projects still needed labor, contracts still had to be awarded, developers still faced cost overruns and delays that someone could promise to fix. In these spaces, captains like DiLeonardo continued to operate, often in ways that were less spectacular than the operations of previous decades, but still damaging to economic fairness and the rule of law. Law enforcement, for its part, had learned from both successes and failures. Prosecutors no longer focused solely on bringing down the boss. They targeted entire layers of the hierarchy at once, aiming to disrupt the financial backbone of the organizations. Investigations into union corruption, garbage carting, waterfront operations, and construction were designed to hit the families where they lived economically. In case after case, FBI agents and U.S. attorneys built detailed charts of how money moved from a union treasury or construction contract, through a series of shell companies and intermediaries, until it reached individuals like DiLeonardo. When later indictments named him in racketeering counts, they reflected years of accumulated intelligence about his activities as a captain and financial organizer. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, then, Michael "Mikey" Scars DiLeonardo stood at a crossroads he could not yet fully see. On one side was the life he had built over 2 decades, respected within his criminal circle, financially comfortable, embedded in a family network that had helped him rise. On the other was a slowly tightening circle of investigations and indictments that would, in time, threaten everything he had gained and expose the full extent of the world he had helped sustain. For the moment, he moved forward as he always had, handling business, managing relationships, balancing the expectations of superiors above him and associates below. The full cost of those choices, to himself and to those around him, was still coming into view. In the years after John Gotti's conviction in 1992, as the cameras shifted away from the Teflon Don, and the public assumed the story was winding down, Michael "Mikey" Scars DiLeonardo's influence was quietly reaching its peak. The man who had once hovered at the edge of social clubs in Brooklyn was now a full-fledged captain in the Gambino family, responsible for a crew, for money that moved through unions and construction firms, and for enforcing the unspoken rules that held the organization together. If the spectacle of Gotti's trials had defined the late 1980s and early 1990s, the rest of that decade belonged to men like DiLeonardo, figures who operated just far enough from the spotlight to keep the machinery running, while law enforcement celebrated its high-profile victories. From Staten Island, where he lived among other middle-class families in quiet residential streets, Michael commuted into a world that looked, on its surface, like ordinary business. Meetings took place in diners, offices above storefronts, or back rooms of restaurants rather than in the old-style social clubs that had drawn too much attention during the Gotti years. He met contractors bidding on city projects, union officials concerned about keeping their positions, and small business owners facing labor disputes or competitive pressure. To many of these people, he was not introduced as a criminal figure, but as someone who could help, someone with access to decision-makers and the ability to ease obstacles that might otherwise stall a project for months. Court testimony and FBI affidavits from later years would describe in detail how this help was monetized. On a major construction job, the Gambino family and their counterparts in other families might expect a cut of certain contracts or a steady flow of payments disguised as consulting fees, inflated invoices, or cash in envelopes. Unions could be nudged to accept particular subcontractors. Delivery companies friendly to the family might be guaranteed work. Competing bidders could be discouraged, sometimes with nothing more than a quiet word about who was involved. These arrangements did not always require open threats. In neighborhoods where the history of organized crime was well known, the mere knowledge that a figure like DiLeonardo stood behind a proposal often sufficed to bring people into line. As a captain, Michael's responsibilities extended beyond any single racket. He acted as a manager, mediator, and political operative within the Gambino hierarchy. Soldiers and associates brought him problems: a dispute over territory, a conflict with another crew, an argument over how to split profits from a joint venture. On other occasions, senior figures in the family called on him to deliver messages, to sit in on strategy sessions, or to help evaluate opportunities. This middle position, answering upward and downward, required a constant balancing act. Show too little initiative, and you risked being seen as dead weight. Push too aggressively, and you might be perceived as a threat or as someone likely to attract unwanted attention. The nickname Mikey Scars, derived from acne marks on his face from youth, belied the way he carried himself. Those who watched him in public settings noticed that he projected a controlled, almost understated presence. He dressed well, spoke in measured tones, and often let others do the talking before he stepped in to summarize or decide. Prosecutors and agents who later spent hours with him in debriefings described a man who remembered dates, names, and financial arrangements with striking clarity, a skill that had served him well when his job required tracking who owed what to whom across a network of businesses and individuals. During this period, his relationship with the Gotti family deepened, especially with John A. Gotti, known as Jr., the imprisoned boss's eldest son. As John Gotti Sr.'s legal troubles mounted in the early 1990s and then solidified into a life sentence, Jr. increasingly took on day-to-day leadership functions on the street. He relied on a small circle of trusted captains and advisors to manage the family's affairs, maintain alliances, and keep revenue streams intact in the face of growing law enforcement scrutiny. DiLeonardo was part of that circle. Court records and later testimony make clear that he acted not only as a crew boss, but also as a key conduit between Jr. and other segments of the organization. This role placed him close to the nerve center of Gambino decision-making. When debates arose about how aggressively to push into new forms of illegality, or how to handle tensions with other families, his perspective carried weight. The 1990s saw organized crime figures experiment more actively with white-collar schemes, marketing scams, stock manipulation, and other financial crimes that seemed to carry lower immediate risk than traditional forms of violence. While traditional rackets like gambling, bookmaking, and loan sharking continued, the opportunity to tap into the booming financial markets of the decade was tempting. In some cases, captains aligned with the Gambinos used their reputation to back small brokerage operations or boiler rooms that promised quick profits by promoting dubious stocks. Even when not personally orchestrating the minutiae of such schemes, someone in DiLeonardo's position would be called upon to resolve disputes over control and shares of profit when mob-backed ventures intersected. At home, the demands of this life cast a long, often invisible shadow. The expectations of Cosa Nostra did not pause for birthdays, anniversaries, or school events. A captain was expected to be reachable, responsive, and available in times of crisis, whether that crisis was a major indictment or a late-night dispute that threatened to escalate. Over the years, this contributed to a growing strain within Michael's family life. His long absences and the secrecy surrounding much of what he did could not help but generate tension. In later years, he would speak openly about the cost his choices imposed on his wife and children, acknowledging that the promise of security and comfort he thought he was providing came with a price tag few outside that world could fully understand. As the decade progressed, law enforcement's focus shifted more and more from spectacular trials to systemic dismantling. In New York and beyond, federal strike forces coordinated investigations that targeted the intersection of organized crime and legitimate industries. Grand juries heard testimony from union officials, contractors, and lower-level associates willing, under subpoena, to describe how decisions were made and where money went. These inquiries produced a steady stream of indictments against figures from all the major families, including the Gambinos. While the press sometimes treated these cases as minor compared to the grand dramas of earlier years, for the organizations involved they were deeply disruptive, cutting into revenue and forcing constant reorganization. DiLeonardo did not escape this dragnet. Through the mid and late 1990s, his name began appearing more frequently in court papers and surveillance logs. Federal cases targeting corruption in specific unions and construction trades cited him as a participant in meetings, a recipient of payments, or a mediator between union leadership and mob controllers. Some of these cases led to formal charges. Others remained as background intelligence, folded into broader racketeering theories that prosecutors were patiently assembling. Each time an indictment was unsealed that touched his world, he had to respond, consulting lawyers, discussing strategy with other defendants, and crucially, deciding how much risk he was willing to absorb personally for the sake of the family. The pattern of arrest and release, of being named in one case while working to keep others at bay, was part of life for a man in his position. To the outside world, this might have looked like an unmistakable warning sign. The law was closing in. The old systems were failing. Within the culture of Cosa Nostra, however, such run-ins were almost part of the job description. A certain level of legal trouble was expected for someone in the middle or upper ranks. What mattered from the perspective of the organization was how you responded, whether you kept silent, whether you took a plea that did not harm others, whether you showed up in court carrying yourself as a loyal soldier rather than a man looking for a way out. For many years, DiLeonardo met those expectations, reinforcing his reputation as dependable under pressure. This loyalty extended beyond the courtroom. Internally, disputes sometimes arose over how money should be divided, which crew had rights to a particular racket, or how to interpret decisions handed down from the top. In such moments, a captain had to choose sides carefully. Aligning with the wrong faction could stall a career or even create personal danger. During the shifting leadership arrangements that followed Gotti's imprisonment, as figures like Junior Gotti, Peter Gotti, and others assumed various levels of authority, Michael navigated these currents with a blend of caution and firmness. His long-standing ties to the Delacroix line and the Gotti family gave him standing, but they also bound him to leaders who were prime targets of law enforcement. At the same time, the culture around organized crime in New York was changing. Younger men in the neighborhoods where the Gambinos had once recruited freely were less uniformly drawn to the life. The crack epidemic, the spread of street gangs outside the traditional mafia structure, and the visible consequences of long prison sentences made some potential recruits wary. The romanticized image of the neighborhood protector had been eroded by decades of news coverage showing mob figures in handcuffs, their conversations played back in federal courtrooms. For a captain trying to maintain a crew, this meant more effort spent on retaining reliable associates, ensuring their loyalty, and where possible, offering them enough financial benefit to make the risks seem worthwhile. Behind the scenes, DiLeonardo's financial footprint grew. Beyond the cash that flowed from construction and labor rackets, he had stakes, sometimes open, sometimes hidden, in various legal businesses. Restaurant investments, real estate interests, and service companies linked to construction sites all provided ways to park money and to blend illicit and legitimate income. When federal investigators later mapped out his financial dealings, they found a web that reflected both genuine entrepreneurial ability and the leverage that came from his Gambino status. It was this blend that made him particularly valuable, and later particularly dangerous to the organization once he chose to cooperate. He knew not only who ordered what, but also how the money was actually moved. Yet even as his influence and wealth increased, the fragility of his position was becoming harder to ignore. The same surveillance techniques that had brought down earlier generations of bosses had only become more sophisticated. Hidden recording devices grew smaller and more reliable, phone taps more extensive, financial records easier to analyze with new computer tools. Agents no longer had to catch a mob figure asking for money directly. They could piece together conversations, bank deposits, and sudden changes in lifestyle to demonstrate a pattern of racketeering. For someone like Michael, whose every significant move was now of interest to one or more investigative teams, the margin for error was shrinking. Occasional brushes with the full strength of the legal system made this reality uncomfortably clear. When he sat in court as a defendant alongside other Gambino figures in the late 1990s, listening to former associates or business contacts testify under oath, he could see in real time how the code of silence that had once protected men like him was eroding. Witness protection programs, the threat of long sentences under RICO, and the shifting cultural stigma around cooperating with authorities meant that more people were willing to talk than in his mentor's era. Each new cooperator brought with them stories that overlapped with his own activities, knitting together a tapestry of evidence that became harder and harder to dismiss as mere government fabrication. In private moments, the stress of this environment weighed heavily. He was responsible not only for himself, but for the men he supervised, and for the family that still depended on him at home. Legal fees mounted each time he was drawn into a new case. The need to keep paying tributes upward, supporting associates downward, and maintaining an appearance of control created constant financial and psychological pressure. In the old mythology of organized crime, the captain's life was portrayed as a pinnacle of power and comfort. In practice, particularly by the end of the 1990s, it often felt more like standing in the middle of a narrowing corridor, with legal walls closing in from all sides. Still, he stayed the course. Habit, belief in the system that had raised him, and the simple absence of any acceptable alternative kept him in place. The idea of walking away was not, at this point, a realistic option in his mind. Men did not simply resign from the Gambino family. Those who tried risked isolation at best and serious retaliation at worst. And for someone as deeply embedded as Michael, linked not just by money but by marriage, history, and personal loyalty, the notion of becoming a government witness would have seemed unthinkable. What he could not see, though some investigators could, was that the pattern of his life contained all the elements that would eventually push him to that very point. A career spent close to the center of the Gambino machinery meant he was a prime target when prosecutors designed indictments to cripple the organization's ability to reach into unions and construction. The reliance of higher-ups on his competence meant that, when he was charged, he would face those charges not as a peripheral figure who could cut a quick deal, but as a central player expected to absorb enormous risk. And the personal sacrifices he had made for decades, justified in his mind as necessary for the sake of his family, would one day be thrown into question in the most painful way possible. By the end of the 1990s, the stage was set. Federal investigators had accumulated years of recordings, financial documents, and cooperative testimony naming Mikey DiLeonardo as a key Gambino captain, involved in racketeering schemes stretching from New York's waterfronts to its high-rise construction sites. Inside the family, he was regarded as one of the most capable and trusted figures of his generation. Between these two realities lay an inevitable collision. When it came, in the form of sweeping racketeering indictments in the early 2000s that would tie him formally to the enterprise he had served for most of his adult life, it would force him into choices he had spent a lifetime insisting he would never make. By the turn of the new century, the quiet tightening that had shadowed Mikey DiLeonardo through the 1990s finally snapped into place. For years, he had watched colleagues indicted, tried, and sent away under racketeering statutes he had once hoped would never reach him. Now his own name appeared at the top of a federal charging document, printed in black ink above a long list of counts that captured, in the dry language of the law, the life he had been living for decades. The indictment, unsealed in the early 2000s in a New York federal court, charged him and others, among them John A. Jr. Gotti, with racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, and related offenses. Prosecutors alleged that the men on the list were not simply isolated offenders, but participants in an ongoing criminal enterprise, the Gambino family, where once law enforcement reports had referred to alleged connections. The government now spoke bluntly of a structured organization in which DiLeonardo had risen to the rank of captain. The arrest itself was methodical rather than theatrical. There were no television crews waiting outside his Staten Island home when federal agents arrived. They had no interest in staging a spectacle. By this point, everyone understood that the real drama would play out later in court. Agents showed warrants, placed him in custody, and transported him to be processed. For Michael, long accustomed to the risk of periodic questioning and surveillance, There was an undeniable shift, as he felt the cuffs close around his wrists, not as a brief inconvenience, but as the beginning of a sustained legal assault. At his arraignment, standing before a federal judge, he heard the charges read and entered a plea of not guilty. The government argued that his long-term role in Gambino rackets and his access to substantial hidden funds made him both a danger to the community and a flight risk. His lawyers countered that he was a family man with deep local roots, that the case was overblown, and that he had every intention of fighting it. After negotiation and the posting of a substantial bond put together with help from relatives and friends, the court allowed him to await trial under strict conditions: home confinement, electronic monitoring, limited approved movements, and, crucially, an absolute prohibition on contact with known members or associates of organized crime. For a man who had spent his adult life in constant motion between meetings, job sites, and social gatherings, this new existence felt both claustrophobic and unreal. Days blurred into one another inside his home. He could speak to his lawyers, attend tightly controlled legal meetings, and see immediate family, but the casual, daily contact with his crew and with other Gambino figures that had once defined his routine was suddenly forbidden. Still, he tried to convince himself that this was temporary, that he would beat the case like earlier generations had, and that the organization he had served would rally around him. Behind the scenes, he worked closely with Junior Gotti and the shared defense team to develop a strategy. Their experience with the justice system had been shaped by an era when mafia trials often ended in acquittals, mistrials, or modest sentences negotiated by skilled attorneys. Even after the Gotti conviction in 1992, some in the family still clung to the idea that determined resistance could wear down the government's case. Michael, steeped in that culture, initially adopted the same posture. He pored over discovery materials, transcripts of recorded conversations, financial records, witness statements, looking for weaknesses or inconsistencies that could be exploited at trial. But the very restrictions imposed by his bail conditions made it difficult to manage both. His legal defense and his status inside the Gambino hierarchy. As a captain, he had always been expected to maintain contact with his crew, to keep income flowing, and to settle disputes. Now he was suddenly cut off from that network, at least officially. The expectation from above, however, did not vanish. Messages found their way to him through intermediaries and coded conversations. Assurances that he would be taken care of, reminders that loyalty was expected, and hints about the financial and legal support the family would provide. The pressure to remain involved, even indirectly, proved hard to resist. Despite the explicit court order, he maintained contact with some figures from his old life, sometimes through third parties, sometimes more directly. To him, these interactions may have felt like necessary maintenance of obligations built up over years. To the federal agents still monitoring his world, they were a violation waiting to be documented. When surveillance showed him meeting with other known Gambino members and associates in a restaurant and engaging in conversations that went far beyond simple social chatter, prosecutors went back to the judge and argued that his bail had been abused. The court agreed. His bond was revoked. In an instant, the relative comfort of house arrest was replaced by the harsh routines of pretrial detention at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. The drive across the Verrazano Narrows Bridge and through the city, flanked by marshals, marked a sharp emotional descent. Behind the walls and razor wire of the MDC, he was no longer a neighborhood power broker, but an inmate awaiting trial, his movements dictated by correctional schedules and security protocols. Life inside the jail was stripped down to essentials: a narrow bed, a small cell, set meal times, limited phone calls, and a constant, low hum of tension. Among the jail population were other alleged mob figures, drug dealers, white-collar defendants, and men accused of every variety of crime. Those with connections to the Gambino family often recognized him, and there were coded nods, quiet conversations in recreation areas, and exchanges of jailhouse information. Yet the underlying message that filtered back to him from the outside was more worrying. The level of support he had expected to receive, from the family as an institution, and from specific individuals he had helped over the years, was noticeably less than what old-timers had described in their stories of arrests past. Legal bills mounted quickly. Federal racketeering trials were complex, document-heavy, and prolonged. They required teams of lawyers, investigators, and experts. In earlier decades, high-ranking defendants could expect the family to help offset these costs, especially for someone of Michael's rank and closeness to the Gotti line. But the 2000s were not the 1970s. Years of prosecutions had thinned the ranks and drained resources. Money that might once have gone into legal defense funds had been swallowed by forfeitures, asset seizures, and the simple erosion of old revenue streams. As he sat in his cell, wrangling through his attorneys over who would pay what, he began to feel a gnawing sense of being left exposed. The strain bled into his personal life. Phone calls home, monitored by the jail, grew more tense. His wife struggled to manage household bills, legal fees, and the emotional turmoil of having a husband facing the possibility of a decades-long sentence. Arguments over money, how much had been set aside, where it was, who controlled it, became more frequent. When Michael complained that the family was not stepping up as expected, that promises were going unfulfilled, it was not just a financial grievance. It was an attack on the entire belief system that had justified his career. For years, he had accepted risk on the understanding that, if the worst happened, the organization would look after his loved ones. Now, at the moment of maximum need, that understanding seemed to be unraveling. Worse still were the personal revelations that began to filter through visits and second-hand reports. With him locked up and their finances under siege, his marriage came under enormous strain. Later accounts, some from his own testimony, some from media interviews, describe how he came to believe that his wife had not only mishandled funds, but had also emotionally distanced herself from him and moved toward a new life independent of the man sitting in the MDC. The specifics varied across tellings, but the emotional impact was clear. The person he had seen as his closest partner was pulling away at the same time that his criminal family seemed to be doing the same. In that double sense of abandonment, by the organization and at home, the code he had lived by for decades began to feel less like an unbreakable bond and more like a one-sided obligation. Sitting in a small visiting room, listening to lawyers outline sentencing guidelines that translated into the real possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars, he was forced to confront a bleak calculation. Under the racketeering counts he faced, a conviction at trial could easily result in a term measured in decades. Even at his age, that meant the near certainty of growing old and possibly dying in prison. The memory of older men who had accepted exactly that fate, some of them venerated as martyrs to the cause, now looked less like a noble tradition and more like a grim warning. Prosecutors, veterans of earlier mafia cases, understood the psychological terrain all too well. They had watched it play out with figures like Sammy Gravano and others, a man forged in loyalty facing an overwhelming case, uncertain financial support, and a personal life in crisis. Through his attorneys, they made sure Michael was reminded of the full scope of the government's evidence. They pointed out that they were not building their case on rumors. They had tapes, documents, and, increasingly, the cooperation of other insiders willing to take the stand. They also made clear that the sentencing landscape offered a stark fork in the road. Fight and lose, and he could expect a punishment that would likely keep him in federal custody for the rest of his natural life. Plead guilty and cooperate fully, and the government would ask the court to consider a far lower sentence, potentially allowing him to one day walk free. At first, he rejected the idea. Decades of indoctrination could not be undone overnight. The label attached to government witnesses in that world, informant, cooperator, rat, was one of the worst imaginable. He had known men who had refused any deal regardless of the odds, insisting on their loyalty even as they were let off to serve life terms. In conversations with other inmates and with himself, he replayed the arguments he had heard all his life, that the government exaggerated, that juries could be swayed, that good lawyers could pick apart RICO cases. He told his counsel to prepare for trial. But time in jail has a way of eroding certainty. Days turned into weeks, then months. Each legal meeting ended with the same sobering assessment. The evidence was strong, the potential sentence severe, and the resources available to mount a long, aggressive defense were limited. Each monitored phone call home reminded him that the financial and emotional reserves of his family were dwindling. Occasionally, newspapers that made their way into the facility carried stories of other mob figures who had chosen cooperation and were now testifying in case after case. Men he had once sat with in restaurants and back rooms were now appearing on witness stands, describing operations that overlapped with his own life. The turning point did not come in a single dramatic outburst, but in a series of quiet decisions. In one meeting, he allowed his lawyer to listen a bit more carefully when prosecutors outlined what a cooperation agreement would involve. In another, he asked specific questions about what would happen to his family's safety and financial situation if he took that step. Gradually, the abstract possibility of becoming a government witness transformed into a concrete option, with detailed obligations and potential benefits. He would have to admit his crimes in full, provide truthful information about others in the Gambino family and allied groups, submit to extensive debriefings, and be willing to testify in open court against former associates and even former superiors. In exchange, the government would agree to advocate for a reduced sentence and to take steps to protect him, and to the extent possible, his immediate family. Eventually, after long nights in his cell and a hard reckoning with the likelihood of spending the rest of his life behind bars if he did not change course, Michael gave his lawyer an instruction that would have been unimaginable to his younger self. He was ready to talk. The lawyer, in turn, relayed this to federal prosecutors, and the machinery of cooperation, honed over decades of similar cases, whirred into motion. The first formal step was a so-called proffer session, often referred to in legal slang as a queen for a day meeting. In a secure conference room, accompanied by his attorney, he sat across from a team of prosecutors and FBI agents. The rules were simple but unforgiving. In exchange for certain limited protections about how his words at that meeting could be used, he was expected to tell the unvarnished truth about his own criminal conduct and what he knew of others. Any lie, evasion, or significant omission would likely kill any cooperation deal and leave him facing trial with new ammunition in the government's hands. For a man conditioned to speak in code and conceal details, it was a jarring inversion of everything he had practiced. Over hours and then days of such sessions, he began to unwind the narrative of his life in organized crime, how he had come up in Brooklyn, how he had been introduced to Delacroce's circle, how he had earned his way into the Gambino family, and how the family had moved money through unions, construction projects, and legitimate-looking businesses. Agents asked focused questions about dates, locations, names, and specific transactions, and took meticulous notes. Sometimes they pushed back when his accounts did not fully align with information they already had from wiretaps or other cooperators. Each time, he had to decide whether to hold back and risk everything, or to push through his own reluctance and speak plainly. Once prosecutors were satisfied that he was prepared to fully and truthfully cooperate, they offered a formal agreement. He would plead guilty to racketeering and related charges, acknowledging in open court his participation in the Gambino family's illegal activities. The government, in turn, would advise the sentencing judge of the value of his assistance and recommend leniency in light of his cooperation. He signed. In a quiet courtroom appearance, flanked by marshals and lawyers, he entered his guilty plea. Gone was the defiance typical of early arraignments. Instead, under questioning from the judge, he calmly affirmed that he understood the rights he was giving up, the maximum penalties he faced, and the obligations he had undertaken as a cooperator. When asked to describe in his own words what he had done, he spoke in general but clear terms about his role in the Gambino family's racketeering activities. For the record, he publicly acknowledged ties that men of his generation had been trained to deny until death. News of his decision to cooperate traveled quickly through the underworld. Within days, men who had once toasted him at weddings and meetings were referring to him in the harshest terms reserved for those who broke omertà. In the cultural code he had lived by, there was no more serious betrayal than taking the witness stand against one's own. From the Gambino perspective, it did not matter that he felt abandoned or that he believed the organization had failed to uphold its side of the bargain. What mattered was that he had crossed a line that, in theory, no made man was ever supposed to cross. For law enforcement, his flip was a breakthrough. Here was a high-ranking captain with close ties to the Gotti family, deeply involved in construction and union racketeering, willing to lay out the inner workings of one of the most powerful mafia families in the country. Investigators who had spent years piecing together fragments of intelligence now had a guide capable of connecting them, explaining which conversations mattered and which did not, and identifying voices and code words on tapes that had previously been only partly understood. Prosecutors, planning future trials, began to rewrite their strategies around the narrative he could provide. In the months that followed, DiLeonardo was moved out of the general jail population and into more secure, controlled environments appropriate for a high-profile cooperator. He rotated through debriefings not only in New York, but with federal teams from other districts looking into related cases. Each new group of agents brought their own stack of reports, tapes, and questions, and each time he was expected to be consistent, precise, and exhaustive. He was no longer simply defending himself. He was actively helping the government build cases against the very structure that had once defined his identity. The personal cost of this transformation was immense. He knew that by stepping forward as a cooperator, he had cut himself off permanently from the world in which he had become Mikey Scars, the respected Gambino captain. Old friendships were finished. Relatives tied to the life would be forced to distance themselves or risk suspicion. His children, already grappling with the stigma of his arrest, would now have to navigate the even more complicated shadow cast by a father who had become a symbol of broken loyalty to some, and an emblem of long-hidden truths to others. Yet there was no turning back. The same rigidity that had once kept him loyal to the Gambinos now held him to his deal with the government. To retreat, to stop cooperating midway, would invite the worst of both worlds. A furious crime family and federal prosecutors free to seek the maximum sentence without any obligation to request mercy. So he pressed on, step by step, through interviews, document reviews, and strategy sessions, preparing for the next phase of his transformation, moving from the relative privacy of debriefing rooms to the unforgiving glare of the witness stand, where he would publicly narrate the rise and operations of the Gambino family from the inside, and in doing so, attempt to secure his own future by dismantling the organization that had once given his life its shape. When Mikey Scars, DiLeonardo finally walked into a federal courtroom as a government witness, he was no longer the sharply dressed captain who had once moved easily through Staten Island restaurants and Brooklyn social clubs. He entered in prison khakis, escorted by marshals, his hands no longer weighed down by jewelry but by the reality of his situation. For years, his name had circulated in indictments and surveillance reports as a key Gambino player. Now it appeared on the witness list, and the very people who had once built cases around him were preparing to build new ones with him. His first major appearance as a cooperator came in Brooklyn, in a racketeering case aimed at the Gambino family's upper ranks, including a Gotti brother and other established figures tied to waterfront and union rackets. The stakes were high. Prosecutors were not just trying to put individual defendants behind bars. They were trying to show a jury, in concrete terms, how a modern Cosa Nostra family operated as a continuing criminal enterprise. To do that, they needed someone who could move fluently between the world of mob hierarchy and the language of ordinary life. DiLeonardo, a former captain with long experience in both legitimate-looking business and traditional rackets, fit that need exactly. Taking the stand, he swore the same oath he had taken years earlier when he first spoke to prosecutors in private, but the atmosphere in open court was very different. The defense tables were occupied by men he had known for years. Some he had worked alongside, others he had reported to, all of them now staring at him as if trying to will him into silence. Spectators' benches were crowded with reporters, curious onlookers, and the families of both defendants and victims of extortion and corruption. The jurors, many of them unfamiliar with the intricate structure of New York's mob families, leaned forward as he began to speak. Under careful questioning by the government, DiLeonardo laid out the basic architecture of the Gambino organization: bosses, underbosses, consiglieri, captains, soldiers, and associates. He described his own induction in the late 1980s, explaining in broad strokes the ceremony that had made him a made man, bound by oath to the family. Then he shifted to the practical realities: how money was collected, how unions were influenced, how construction jobs were carved up. The prosecutors guided him through specific schemes outlined in the indictment: arrangements involving freight contracts, manipulation of shipping terminals, and quiet but profitable control over certain unions. What struck many observers was the unvarnished way he discussed what for years had been romanticized or mythologized. There were no elaborate codes of honor, no cinematic speeches, just a steady explanation of how influence was bought and sold, how fear and reputation were used to steer business decisions, and how envelopes of cash moved from union offices and job sites up the chain of command. He named companies, described meetings, and identified voices on tape recordings that the jury had already heard. Where government exhibits had previously been just documents and muffled conversations, his testimony linked them to specific people and decisions. The defense strategy was predictable and relentless. On cross-examination, attorneys for the accused attacked his credibility with every tool available. They highlighted his admitted crimes, including years of extortion, illegal gambling, and financial schemes. They reminded the jury that he had come forward only after facing the prospect of a long prison term, suggesting that his cooperation was driven solely by self-interest. They pointed to any inconsistencies between his current accounts and statements he had made earlier in his career when he was still loyal to the Gambinos. They asked whether he had ever lied under oath or misled investigators in the past. The message to the jury was clear: this man is a criminal, a self-confessed liar, and now he is asking you to believe him because it serves him. This kind of assault was not unexpected. Federal agents had prepared him for it in countless pre-trial sessions, rehearsing potential lines of attack and pressing him on weak points in his own story so that he would not be caught off guard in front of the jury. His response, when the real moment came, was to lean into the obvious, to admit freely that he had done wrong, that he had spent decades breaking the law, and that he had indeed come forward only when it became clear what kind of sentence he faced. But he insisted that did not make his current testimony false. If anything, he argued, it gave him a powerful reason to tell the truth now, because the sentencing judge who would one day determine his fate would be reviewing not only his cooperation but his honesty and consistency. In the end, the jury found the government's overall case persuasive. Several of the defendants, including senior Gambino figures, were convicted on significant racketeering counts. Sentences measured in decades followed. For those who had once shared tables and schemes with DiLeonardo, the knowledge that one of their own had helped secure those verdicts was bitter. For federal prosecutors, the result validated their strategy of investing in long-term relationships with high-level cooperators rather than relying only on low-level informants or standalone wiretaps. That trial was just the beginning. Over the next several years, Mikey Scars, DiLeonardo became a familiar figure on witness stands in New York. He testified in multiple trials aimed at dismantling what remained of the Gambino leadership and at undermining the family's reach into labor unions, construction, and other industries. His background made him particularly useful in cases that were technically complex. In one, he walked jurors through how mob influence had quietly shaped decisions in major building projects, who received contracts, which unions dominated certain tasks, how inflated costs were hidden in paperwork. In another, he explained how extortion could function without overt threats, relying instead on a shared understanding of who stood behind a particular demand. Perhaps the most widely watched of his appearances came in the mid-2000s in Manhattan, when he testified against John A. Jr. Gotti in a series of racketeering trials. The son of John Gotti Sr. Jr. had already served time on earlier federal charges and had formally announced, through his lawyers, that he had retired from the mafia years before. Prosecutors, armed in part with DiLeonardo's testimony, argued that this so-called retirement was more public relations than reality, and that Jr. had continued to exert influence over Gambino operations well after his supposed exit. On the stand in those trials, DiLeonardo described in detail his interactions with Jr. during the 1990s, painting a picture of a young Gotti who had stepped into a leadership role after his father's imprisonment. He spoke about meetings where strategy was discussed, about payments delivered up the chain, and about specific extortion and gambling schemes in which he said Jr. had a direct hand. The prosecution's goal was not simply to convict one man, but to undercut the narrative that the younger Gotti had left that world behind. Defense lawyers again struck back hard. They portrayed DiLeonardo as an embittered former insider seeking revenge on a family he believed had failed him. They highlighted his cooperation deal, emphasizing that his freedom depended on pleasing the very prosecutors now questioning him. They put forward their own witnesses and interpretations of the same events, arguing that payments he described as mob tributes were, in fact, routine business dealings or gestures of respect, without criminal intent. Juries in those trials listened as day after day he recounted episodes from his life inside the Gambino organization, then listened as defense counsel tried to pick apart his stories line by line. The outcomes of the Junior Gotti trials reflected the complexity of the evidence and the evolving attitudes of jurors. Several ended in mistrials, with juries unable to reach unanimous verdicts on key counts despite weeks of testimony and extensive cross-examination. For prosecutors, these partial setbacks were frustrating, though they still believed his testimony had exposed valuable truths about the inner workings of the family. For DiLeonardo himself, the hung juries were a reminder that even the most detailed insider account did not always translate smoothly into clear outcomes in court. Away from the public glare of the courtroom, his cooperation continued along more hidden paths. He spent countless hours in interview rooms with agents and prosecutors from different districts, not only in New York but in other parts of the country, where Gambino interests overlapped with local investigations. They asked about specific individuals, about meetings they had heard referenced on tapes, about companies or union locals whose names appeared in seized documents. He drew organizational charts from memory, explained who answered to whom, and clarified the significance of coded phrases used in intercepted conversations. One enduring area of focus was labor corruption. For decades, parts of the construction trade in New York had been under varying degrees of mob influence, and the government was determined to break those ties wherever possible. DiLeonardo, with his years of experience in that sector, provided insight into how mob-backed representatives had maneuvered into union positions, how contracts were steered towards certain companies, and how kickbacks were disguised as legitimate fees or bonuses. His information contributed to cases that led to reforms in some unions, changes in how contracts were awarded, and the removal or prosecution of officials found to be acting as fronts for organized crime. Throughout this period, he lived under the strict controls reserved for high-risk cooperators. The U.S. Marshals Service and associated agencies managed his housing, movements, and to a significant extent, his daily life. He was shifted among secure locations, largely cut off from his old neighborhoods and routines. Contact with family members was limited and closely monitored. He was expected to avoid any appearance of new illegal activity. Even minor missteps could jeopardize his agreement and his safety. In later interviews, he would describe this phase as a strange half-existence, neither in prison nor truly free, trading the familiar dangers of his old world for a more isolated, controlled, and uncertain one. In time, his cooperation produced tangible benefits in his own legal trajectory. The same judges who had once stared down at a captain facing the possibility of a lifetime behind bars now reviewed detailed letters from federal prosecutors describing the extent and value of his assistance. They listed the trials in which he had testified, the investigations he had advanced, and the risks he had assumed by turning against an organization known for harsh reactions to perceived betrayal. Sentencing guidelines that had once pointed toward virtual life terms were revisited in light of those contributions. When he finally appeared for sentencing on his own charges, the courtroom dynamic had shifted. The prosecutors who had once prepared to argue for a lengthy punishment now stood to ask for mercy within the structure allowed by law. They did not present him as a hero. His admitted crimes were too serious for that, but as someone who had made a decisive break with his past and had helped the government hold others accountable. The judge, bound by statute but allowed some discretion, imposed a term far below the maximums he had faced before cooperation, crediting the years he had already spent in custody and acknowledging his sustained assistance. For the Gambino family and the broader world of organized crime in New York, the cumulative effect of his cooperation was substantial. Convictions of senior figures, disruption of long-standing rackets, and the exposure of internal operations all contributed to a weakening of the old structures. The families did not disappear. Criminal organizations rarely vanish entirely, but their ability to operate with the same breadth and confidence as in earlier decades was seriously diminished. Younger members saw, repeatedly, that high-ranking figures who had once seemed unshakably loyal were now willing to testify when faced with the full weight of federal prosecution and personal upheaval. At the same time, his story underscored the deeply personal cost of such a choice. To his former colleagues in the mob, he would forever be marked as someone who had broken the central rule of their subculture. To many in law enforcement, he was a valuable but complicated figure, someone who had spent years harming communities before finally helping to hold others accountable. To his family, he was both a provider whose decisions had once brought material comfort and a source of turmoil whose life choices had dragged them through public scandal, financial strain, and relocation under the shadow of potential retaliation. As the 2000s gave way to the 2010s, Mikey Scars, DiLeonardo, gradually moved out of the formal structures of cooperation. He completed his testimony in major cases, continued to answer questions when called upon, and served the balance of the reduced sentence imposed after consideration of his assistance. Eventually, he left federal custody behind. The man who emerged was legally free, but carried with him a past that could not ever fully be set aside. Years as a Gambino captain, followed by years as one of the government's most prominent mafia cooperators. How he navigated life after that, outside prison, away from the rigid hierarchies of organized crime, and far from the routines of witness rooms and courtrooms, would form the next, more introspective chapter of a story that had already traced the rise and unraveling of one man's life in America's most infamous criminal fraternity. By the mid-2000s, Michael "Mikey Scars" DiLeonardo was no longer simply a former captain who had decided to cooperate. He had become one of the federal government's most frequently used guides to the inner workings of late 20th century Cosa Nostra. Prosecutors from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and eventually from other districts as well, knew that if they could put him in front of a jury, he could take a stack of dry wiretap transcripts and ledger sheets and turn them into a coherent story. Who was talking, who they answered to, what the coded phrases meant, and how the money actually moved. Each time he was brought back to New York to testify, the routine was consistent. Marshals moved him quietly from whatever secure facility or protected location he was living in at the time, delivered him through back entrances to courthouses he had once entered as a defendant, and sat him in holding rooms until it was time to take the stand. When his name was called and he walked into the courtroom, the reaction was immediate. Former associates, now on the other side of the room at the defense table, stared hard, sometimes with open contempt. Defense lawyers sized him up, preparing to attack his credibility. Jurors, reminded in opening statements that he had been a long-time member of the Gambino family, watched him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. On direct examination, the prosecutor's questions followed a familiar pattern. They began by walking him through his background, where he was born, how he grew up, how he came into contact with the Gambinos when he was inducted, and what position he ultimately held. These details, repeated in trial after trial, served a legal purpose. They established that he spoke not as an outsider speculating about organized crime, but as someone who had occupied a central role in it. Then the questions narrowed to the specific case at hand, the defendants seated in front of him, the schemes they were charged with, and the conversations and meetings he had witnessed or joined. In trials involving figures close to the Gotti family, he laid out the structure of the Gambino leadership after John Gotti's imprisonment. How Junior Gotti had taken on a de facto leadership role, how captains like himself reported up, and how tribute payments were organized. In cases targeting union corruption or construction fraud, he explained how certain locals were ours, meaning controlled by particular families, how contractors were told which firms to use for deliveries or specialized work, how no-show jobs could be used to funnel money to favored individuals. For jurors who had never set foot on a New York job site, his explanations turned abstract RICO counts into vivid, if restrained, depictions of how criminal influence insinuated itself into everyday economic life. The defense strategy, in case after case, centered on undermining him rather than on denying that the Gambino family existed. Lawyers reminded juries that he had participated in the very crimes he was now describing, that he had lied for years to investigators and the public, and that his cooperation agreement gave him a powerful incentive to tailor his testimony to please the government. They confronted him with his own past statements, looking for inconsistencies. They asked why a jury should trust a man who had once pledged his loyalty to a criminal organization, and now, under pressure, had pledged it to prosecutors instead. On the stand, he responded in a manner that combined defensiveness with painstaking detail. Yes, he acknowledged, he had done what the indictment said he did. Yes, he had lied in the past to protect himself and his associates. That, he told jurors, was precisely why his testimony had value now. He was finally being compelled to tell the truth about a world that had relied on lies and silence. When challenged about his motives, he did not pretend that self-interest played no role. Facing the possibility of dying in prison, abandoned in his view by the very people he had protected for years, he had made a choice. The jurors, he sometimes said bluntly, did not have to like that choice. They only had to decide whether the facts he was describing were supported by other evidence in the record. The results of these trials were mixed but cumulatively significant. In some cases, his testimony helped secure convictions of high-ranking figures. In others, most notably in a series of prosecutions of John A. Jr. Gotti, juries deadlocked, unable to reach unanimous agreement on guilt or innocence. The hung juries in those cases were widely covered in the press, feeding narratives that federal prosecutors had overreached and that cooperating mob witnesses could not always carry the day. For Michael, sitting in secure locations and reading about the outcomes, the reaction was complex. On one hand, every conviction obtained with his help reinforced the government's decision to support him at sentencing. On the other, each mistrial reminded him that the courtroom was an unpredictable arena where his credibility was constantly on trial along with the defendants. Away from the spotlight, his daily reality was defined by the constraints of the federal witness security program. Once he committed fully to cooperating, the U.S. Marshals Service moved him out of the familiar world of New York altogether. Under a new identity, he was resettled in parts of the country where few, if any, people knew his history. The program arranged housing, a modest stipend, and help in finding work. In return, he was expected to follow strict rules: no contact with former criminal associates, no disclosure of his true identity to neighbors or employers, no return to old neighborhoods without explicit permission. For someone whose adult life had been spent wielding authority in his own small corner of New York, this new existence was jarring. Instead of overseeing crews and negotiating with contractors, he found himself taking ordinary jobs that did not require his old connections: work in sales, manual labor, low-profile business roles that paid the bills, but offered none of the status he had once enjoyed. In grocery store aisles and office break rooms, he was just another middle-aged man trying to get by, his past invisible to the people around him. Only when marshals showed up to check on him, or when he was summoned back east to testify, did the old life resurface. The program demanded similar adjustments from his family. Children accustomed to New York schools and extended family nearby were suddenly planted in unfamiliar towns, told to keep quiet about who their father really was and why strangers sometimes appeared at odd hours to speak with him. The stress that had built up during his pretrial detention, financial instability, emotional distance, anger over past choices, did not vanish with relocation. In some respects, it intensified. Relationships that had already been strained by his arrest and decision to flip now had to withstand the constant low-grade anxiety of living under assumed names, never fully at ease. Over time, some of those bonds frayed or broke altogether. His marriage, already under severe strain by the time he entered custody, did not survive the combined weight of prison, cooperation, and relocation. Separation and eventual divorce added another layer of personal loss to a life already marked by rupture. In interviews years later, he spoke not only of the betrayals he believed he had suffered from former criminal associates, but also of the ways in which his own decisions had wounded those closest to him. The code he had once followed had not only failed to protect him, it had, in his view, guaranteed that the people he cared about would pay a lifelong price. While he tried to build a new identity in anonymous suburbs, his old name lived on in court transcripts and law enforcement presentations. Agents used his debriefings to corroborate other sources, to decode older tapes, and to map out historical connections between the Gambinos and other families. In training academies, new FBI recruits heard anonymized stories from his case as examples of how a high-level cooperator could transform an investigation. In academic and journalistic circles, his testimony became one of the standard reference points for understanding how New York's organized crime families had adapted to the late 20th century. Less overt violence in public, more focus on economic influence, and a deep entanglement with unions and construction. Eventually, after years of cooperation and multiple public appearances as a witness, the legal system reached the point it had been deferring: his own sentencing. Unlike a typical defendant who is sentenced soon after conviction or plea, a major cooperator is often left in a kind of legal limbo while the government assesses the full value of his assistance. Once prosecutors were satisfied that he had testified in the key cases they needed him for, they were prepared to stand before a judge and outline what he had done, for and against the law. In a Brooklyn federal courtroom, he appeared once more before a judge who had presided over some of the most significant mafia cases of the era. The prosecution did not minimize his crimes. They described his role as a captain in the Gambino family, his involvement in extortion, illegal control of unions, and long-running racketeering schemes. But they also detailed his cooperation, the dozens of debriefing sessions, the multiple trials in which he had testified, the way his information had helped them secure convictions against figures who might otherwise have remained out of reach. His defense counsel emphasized the same cooperation from a different angle, framing it as evidence of a man who had chosen, however late, to break with a destructive life and to accept responsibility in a concrete way. The sentence the judge ultimately imposed reflected that dual reality. On paper, the statutory maximums for the counts he had pleaded to could have added up to decades. With the government's recommendation for leniency and credit for time already served in custody, his effective prison time was cut dramatically. He would not walk free immediately, but the prospect of eventual release into something like ordinary life moved from the realm of fantasy into a timetable that could be measured in years rather than in the rest of his natural life. When he did leave federal custody and transitioned fully back into the witness protection world, the challenges of long-term resettlement became even clearer. The initial sense of relief, being outside the walls, walking without shackles, waking up without a cell door in front of him, soon gave way to the practical difficulties of starting over in middle age under a name that carried no history. The marshals arranged housing and continued to coordinate relocations as needed, but the day-to-day work of constructing a new existence was his alone. He had to find jobs that would hire someone with a thin paper trail, manage finances without the streams of cash that had once seemed normal, and rebuild some sense of purpose in a life that no longer revolved around the intricate hierarchies of the Gambinos. Over time, friction developed between him and the very program that had kept him alive. He believed that promises made to him about long-term support and security were not being fully honored. Stipends were reduced or ended, relocations he requested were denied or delayed, and he felt that his cooperation, which had exposed him and his family to permanent risk, was not being adequately acknowledged in material terms. The U.S. Marshals Service, for its part, insisted that it had met its obligations under its internal policies, and that the Witness Protection Program was never intended to serve as an open-ended financial guarantee. The dispute spilled into public view when he took the unusual step of suing the federal government, filing a civil case that accused the marshals and other agencies of failing to live up to what he saw as their side of an unwritten bargain. In court filings, he argued that his testimony had been instrumental in major cases and that the government had implicitly, if not explicitly, promised him a level of support that would allow him to live out his post-cooperation years without undue hardship. The government responded that any benefits he had received were discretionary, governed by statute and agency guidelines, and that he had no legal claim to more. The courts ultimately sided with the government, dismissing his lawsuit. Legally, the decision underscored a hard truth about cooperation. Whatever informal understandings may develop between prosecutors and witnesses, only the written terms of an agreement and the formal policies of the program can be enforced. For Michael, the outcome added another layer to his sense of having been used and then set aside. He had already broken with his criminal past in the most public way possible. Now he found himself, in his view, cut loose by the institution that had urged him to do so. At some point after these disputes, he left the Witness Protection Program entirely. The exact contours of that departure, whether he was removed for violating rules or chose to walk away voluntarily, varied in different accounts, but the result was the same. He returned to living under his own name, no longer shielded by the formal apparatus of relocation and secrecy. It was a risky move on its face. Former Gambino associates and allies in other families knew he had cooperated. In the mythology of organized crime, such a man is never fully forgiven. But the practical realities on the street had changed since the days when defectors could reliably expect violent retribution. The major New York families had been weakened by decades of prosecutions, long sentences, and an erosion of the old codes. Killing a high-profile cooperator years after his testimony carried enormous risk, and for organizations increasingly focused on survival rather than vengeance, little tangible benefit. Understanding this shift, and perhaps betting on it, Michael reestablished himself openly, at least to the extent of using his real identity in certain settings and speaking publicly about his past. In the years that followed, he became a source for journalists, authors, and documentary producers trying to explain the decline of the American mafia. He gave interviews to crime reporters who had tracked his story from the beginning, offering his own perspective on the internal politics of the Gambino family, the decisions that had led him to cooperate, and the lessons he believed young men should draw from his trajectory. He appeared in television documentaries and, later, in online video interviews and podcasts, talking in the same controlled, matter-of-fact tone he had used on the witness stand, but now with the freedom to reflect more broadly on what it had all meant. In these appearances, he was careful to avoid romanticizing the life he had once embraced. He spoke instead of its costs, the marriages strained or destroyed, the children raised under a cloud of secrecy and periodic crisis, the constant tension of knowing that any knock on the door might be law enforcement or something worse. He emphasized that the apparent glamour of fast money and neighborhood status masked a basic truth. The structure he had devoted himself to was designed to protect itself, not the individuals within it. When trouble came, he said, each man was essentially on his own, and any sense of mutual obligation could evaporate quickly under pressure. He was equally unsparing about his own choices. Cooperation had not turned him into a moralist. He did not pretend that he had stumbled into crime by accident, or that he had been unaware of the damage his actions inflicted on others. He acknowledged that he had profited from extortion schemes and corrupt business arrangements, that he had helped maintain a climate of fear and unfairness in industries where honest people were trying to make a living. His defense, such as it was, lay not in denial but in the argument that by coming forward, however late, he had at least contributed to exposing and dismantling the system he had helped to run. From the perspective of law enforcement and historians of organized crime, his story occupies a distinctive place in the larger arc of the American mafia. He represented a generation that came of age after the heyday of Prohibition-era bootlegging and the bloody turf wars of mid-century, a generation that found its opportunities less in street corner violence than in the manipulation of labor, construction, and finance. His career showed how deeply embedded Cosa Nostra had become in legitimate-seeming enterprises, and his cooperation illustrated how vulnerable that embeddedness was to sustained legal pressure and the erosion of internal loyalty. For the communities in Brooklyn, Staten Island, and beyond where his story began, the legacy is more ambiguous. Some residents still look back on the old neighborhood figures with a kind of conflicted nostalgia, seeing them as both predators and protectors. Others point to the long-term economic and social consequences of the corruption he once helped perpetuate. Projects that cost more than they should have, unions that failed their rank and file members, young men drawn into a life that offered short-term rewards and long-term damage. In that sense, his later years, spent trying to warn others away from the path he chose, form a coda that does not erase what came before but frames it as a cautionary tale. By the time he entered his 60s and 70s, Michael "Mikey" DiLeonardo was living proof of how thoroughly the world that had shaped him had been transformed. The Gambino family still existed in a diminished form, but it no longer held the kind of visible sway it once had over large swaths of New York's economy and politics. The old social clubs were mostly gone, shuttered or turned into cafes, boutiques, and apartments. Younger generations in his old neighborhoods, facing a very different set of economic and cultural pressures, were as likely to be drawn to digital hustles or legitimate professional careers as to the coded rituals of Cosa Nostra. Looking back across that distance, he occupied an unusual position, both participant and chronicler, both symbol of betrayal in the eyes of some former associates, and a key source of truth for those who sought to understand how an organization as secretive and entrenched as the Gambino family could be brought low. The boy who had once walked past dimly lit social clubs in Brooklyn, without fully grasping what went on inside, had become the man who stood in brightly lit courtrooms and described those inner workings to jurors, judges, and the broader public. In doing so, he helped close a chapter in New York's history that had loomed over his life from the moment he first learned, in whispers, what it meant when someone in the neighborhood was said to be with the family. As the 2010s unfolded, the man once known in FBI files as a Gambino captain was living a life that, on the surface, looked entirely ordinary. Michael "Mikey" DiLeonardo shopped in supermarkets where no one recognized him, sat in traffic like everyone else, and answered to names that were not his own for landlords and employers who knew nothing of his past. Yet even in this lowered profile, the long shadow of his former life never fully receded. Every so often, a call would come from a producer, a reporter, or a lawyer, and the world he had tried to leave behind would pull him back in. His first years out of custody were largely consumed by the practical demands of starting over. Witness protection, however one judged its generosity, was not designed to support a man indefinitely. The stipends and structured assistance that had seemed substantial when he first entered the program dwindled as he was expected to secure his own footing. For someone whose adult experience with business had always been entangled with his Gambino role, with the leverage of reputation and unspoken threat, standing entirely on his own was a new challenge. He took jobs that bore no hint of his past, sales positions, short-term work with small firms, occasional roles that drew on his familiarity with construction or logistics, but not on his old contacts. Each time he filled out a form or sat through an interview, he had to navigate the gap between the official identity he carried in his wallet and the history he carried in his memory. Federal guidelines for cooperators are blunt. Whatever name is on your driver's license is the only one you are supposed to use. The man who had once signed union-related paperwork as a Gambino intermediary now signed entry-level employment contracts as a nondescript middle-aged worker. The emotional adjustment was as significant as the financial one. Power in his former world had been measured by who deferred to you when you walked into a room, whose phone calls you could expect to be returned immediately, which disputes you had the authority to settle. In the offices and warehouses of his new life, none of that applied. Younger supervisors, unaware that they were talking to a former mob captain, spoke to him as they would to any new hire, outlining schedules, reminding him of workplace policies, occasionally criticizing his performance. It was a humbling inversion of the status he had taken for granted in his Gambino years. Meanwhile, his name and story remained active on another plane, one he could not fully control. Court decisions from his criminal cases, transcripts of his testimony, and news reports about his cooperation sat in public databases, accessible to anyone who cared to search. In New York, crime reporters who had covered the Gotti saga and its aftermath continued to reference him in articles, describing him as one of the highest-ranking defectors from the Gambino family. In academic circles, Criminologists and historians cited his testimony in footnotes and endnotes, using it to support analyses of how the mafia's economic operations had evolved. The lawsuit he filed against the federal government over witness protection support, even though it failed, briefly pulled him back onto legal dockets and into the news. Court papers laid out his grievances in formal language, claims that promises had been broken, that arrangements he relied on had been altered, that the risks he and his family continued to face merited more robust backing. The government's reply was equally formal and equally stark. No written contract guaranteed what he described, and agencies had met their obligations under the law. When the courts dismissed his case, the ruling did more than settle one man's complaint. It signaled to current and future cooperators that whatever informal understandings they believed existed, the government's duties ended where written policy and signed cooperation agreements did. For Michael, the decision confirmed his sense, already strong from his experience with the Gambinos, that institutions protect themselves first. He had entered witness protection believing that, after exposing his former criminal colleagues in open court, he was entering a new kind of family that would, in some measure, look after him in return. The reality, as he experienced it, was more bureaucratic and impersonal. Marshals had done their job by moving him, shielding his location, and arranging initial support. When resources tightened or his case faded from immediate importance, there was little appetite to continue making exceptions for him. At the same time, a parallel evolution was taking place in the wider culture. Public fascination with the American mafia did not disappear just because the organizations had weakened. It simply migrated to new platforms. Books continued to be published, but now they sat alongside a growing torrent of documentaries, cable specials, and eventually, long-form interviews on the internet. Former mob figures who had once avoided cameras, whether out of legal fear or adherence to the old code, began to appear more openly in front of them, some as repentant voices warning others away from crime, some as self-styled experts on the life, and some, critics argued, as entrepreneurs trading on their pasts. In this new ecosystem, Michael's name inevitably resurfaced. Producers working on retrospective programs about John Gotti or the decline of the New York families sought him out as a direct link to those eras. He agreed to some of these requests, carefully negotiating what he would and would not discuss. Decades of living with legal constraints and security concerns had taught him caution. Still, in on-camera interviews recorded in anonymous locations, he began to retell parts of his story, not as testimony under oath this time, but as reflection. The themes he emphasized were consistent. He described the early attractions of the life, the proximity to power, the sense of belonging, the idea that a young man from a working-class background could rise faster and farther under the Gambino umbrella than he might through ordinary channels. But he set those images against the consequences, the constant fear of surveillance and betrayal, the long prison sentences that had become standard by the 1990s, the erosion of trust even among supposed brothers. If a young viewer looked at him and saw someone who had made it as a mobster, he wanted them to understand that the end of that story was not luxury, but isolation, legal ruin, and the permanent need to look over one's shoulder. His emergence into the media space also brought him into indirect conflict with other former associates and rivals who had taken their own stories public. In books and interviews, some ex-mobsters who had operated on the periphery of the Gambino family, or who claimed to have, offered accounts of their roles that Michael believed were exaggerated or distorted. From his perspective, these narratives sometimes inflated minor positions into central ones, recast opportunistic interactions as deep alliances, or misrepresented key events in ways that clashed with his own memory and the trial record. Rather than simply grumble in private, he responded in kind, by going on record with his own version. In extended recorded conversations with journalists and independent interviewers, he challenged what he saw as inaccuracies. He outlined chains of command as he had experienced them, specified who had answered to whom, and explained why certain individuals could not have held the authority they claimed. These exchanges were not just matters of personal pride, though pride undoubtedly played a role. They also reflected a deeper concern about how history would remember the era he had lived through. If the loudest voices in the room were, in his view, telling embellished stories, then the public record of how the Gambino family had actually operated would be skewed. One ongoing point of contention centered on the legacy of John A. Jr. Gotti. In the years after his own criminal cases ended with mistrials, and the government eventually dropped further prosecution, Jr. worked carefully to reshape his public image, insisting that he had left organized crime behind and that federal witnesses had lied or overstated his role. Michael, who had testified in some of those trials, rejected that framing. In interviews and, at times, renewed legal proceedings, he reaffirmed under oath that his earlier testimony had been truthful. The back and forth created a peculiar dynamic. Two men once bound through an underworld hierarchy, now arguing in public forums over whose account of that hierarchy, and their relative places in it, should carry the most weight. For all the noise of these disputes, however, the broader trajectory of organized crime in New York continued on its downward slope. Federal and state authorities did not claim complete victory. They knew that criminal networks adapt, splinter, and resurface. But the kind of power the Gambino family had wielded in Michael's prime, over major unions, billion-dollar construction projects, and crucial slices of New York's economic life, had undeniably diminished. To younger viewers of his interviews, especially those living far from the old neighborhoods, the world he described could sound almost historical in the strict sense, a bygone era rather than a present threat. That historical distance allowed a different kind of questioning, one that went beyond sensationalism. In some settings, interviewers asked him to analyze, not just narrate. Why, they wanted to know, had the mafia taken such deep root in mid-century America? Why had men like him been drawn so powerfully to it even as its risks became clearer? And was its decline primarily a result of better law enforcement, changing social conditions, or internal failures? His answers varied in emphasis but circled familiar points. He spoke of the tightly knit Italian-American neighborhoods of his youth, in which legitimate opportunities felt limited, and where men connected to the families appeared to offer a viable alternate ladder of success. He acknowledged that law enforcement strategies had grown far more sophisticated by the 1980s and 1990s, making the old habits of avoiding incriminating conversations and insulating bosses less reliable shields. And he conceded that the organizations themselves had, in some respects, sown the seeds of their own weakening. Violence that drew public attention, bosses who courted media celebrity, and infighting that produced high-profile betrayals had all made it easier for authorities to make their case to juries and judges. At the same time, he rejected the idea that the decline of the traditional mafia meant the end of organized crime as such. From his vantage point, sitting in anonymous living rooms and watching news of international cartels, cyber fraud rings, and transnational financial crimes, he saw a continuity of pattern, groups exploiting trust and fear to control markets and extract illegal profits. The names and ethnic backgrounds might change. The basic dynamics of greed and coercion did not. The lesson he drew was not that his old world had been uniquely evil, but that it had been one manifestation of a broader human tendency that would reappear in other forms, unless constantly checked by law and civic culture. His reflections inevitably turned inward as well. In public forums, when asked whether he regretted cooperating, he tended to answer with a distinction. He did not, he said, regret helping to dismantle the Gambino family's operations, nor did he regret telling the truth about crimes that had harmed workers, businesses, and the integrity of public institutions. What he regretted was ever having joined that life in the first place. From his vantage point as an older man, Looking back on decades of stress, prison time, broken relationships, and the lingering stigma that followed his children and relatives, the early thrill of proximity to power seemed absurdly small compensation. At the same time, he did not romanticize his break with the family as a moral awakening in the purest sense. He was candid that fear of a life sentence, anger at what he saw as abandonment by his superiors, and the collapse of his marriage had all pushed him toward the government's side. The moral language he used later, about righting wrongs, about warning others away from crime, grew in part from that choice rather than wholly preceding it. In a way, this candor made his story more, not less, instructive. It showed that changes of direction in life rarely spring from a single noble impulse. They emerge from a tangle of self-interest, disillusionment, and sometimes a dawning recognition of the damage one has done. His visibility in interviews and documentaries also raised recurring ethical questions for the media. How should filmmakers and podcasters present a man like him? As a cautionary example, a repentant insider, a villain, a victim of his own bad decisions, or some combination. Responsible producers, mindful of both journalistic duty and the victims of organized crime, tried to strike a careful balance. They allowed him to tell his story in his own words, but they contextualized it with commentary from law enforcement officials, scholars, and, where possible, those harmed by the rackets he had helped run. The goal was not to rehabilitate his image, but to use his experiences to illuminate systems that would otherwise remain opaque. In some of these projects, he sat alongside former agents who had once worked cases against him. On camera, there was an odd professional respect. The agents acknowledged that his information had been invaluable. He recognized that their persistence had, in the end, made his old life untenable. Off camera, too, conversations sometimes drifted toward shared memories of particular investigations or trials, each side recalling the same events from very different vantage points. This mutual recognition underscored one of the strangest features of his later life. The fact that the people who now knew him best, outside his family, were the very officials who had once sought his conviction. As the decade wore on and he entered his late 60s, his role as a living repository of a vanishing world became more evident. Many of the men who had mentored him in the Dela Croce and Gotti years were long dead, either of natural causes or in prison. Younger generations of law enforcement officers and historians found in him a direct link to those figures, someone who could describe not just what they did, but how they thought, how they justified their choices, and how they reacted when the pressure mounted. The value of that testimony grew precisely because of its specificity. He could recall, in ordinary language, the seemingly small decisions that, when woven together, created large criminal enterprises. Yet this status as a kind of historical witness did not free him from the burdens of his past. There were still places he could not safely or comfortably go, people he could not safely or comfortably see. The stigma attached to his name in certain circles of Staten Island and Brooklyn remained, even as younger residents who encountered him only through screens felt more curiosity than anger. For some of his contemporaries still loyal to the old code, the passage of time had not softened their view. To them, he would always be the man who had turned on his own, regardless of how justifiable he or anyone else believed that decision to be. He carried that knowledge into every public appearance. Sitting in front of a camera, he spoke in calm tones, but underneath lay an awareness that each word might be watched not only by distant viewers, but by people who had once called him friend. He chose his phrasing carefully, avoided gratuitous personal attacks even when criticizing someone's public claims, and anchored his accounts as much as possible in things that had already been said in court or written in official records. In doing so, he walked a narrow line, revealing enough to be truthful and useful, but not so much as to feel he was expanding the circle of exposure beyond what justice and history required. In the end, the arc of his life traced the rise, entrenchment, and partial fall of a particular form of American organized crime. From a Brooklyn boyhood in which the men at the social club seemed like inevitable features of the landscape, to a Staten Island adulthood in which he himself became one of those men, to a late-life existence defined by cooperation, anonymity, and reflection. Each stage mirrored broader shifts in the city and the country. The New York of his youth, with its tight ethnic enclaves and powerful street-level organizations, is not the New York of the digital era. Yet the temptations and rationalizations that pulled him into the Gambino family retain a recognizable human shape. Whatever judgment one ultimately passes on Michael "Mikey" DiLeonardo, as a criminal, as a cooperator, as a chronicler of a world he helped sustain, his story remains one of the clearest windows into how that world functioned, and into the complex, often painful ways in which individuals move within, and sometimes finally out of, systems that they once believed would define them forever. In the years after he drifted away from formal protection and cautiously reclaimed his own name, Michael "Mikey" DiLeonardo eased into a strange sort of half-visibility. On the one hand, he no longer lived under the total anonymity of a government program. On the other, he existed in a world where, outside a fairly narrow circle of people interested in organized crime history, most strangers had no idea who he was. That allowed him to move through ordinary settings without the constant fear that had defined his first years as a cooperator. Yet the past never disappeared. It resurfaced every time a producer called asking him to appear in a new documentary, every time a writer asked for help parsing an old wiretap transcript, every time a podcast host wanted him to walk listeners through the mechanics of a construction shakedown or a mob sit-down. Slowly, he began to accept more of those invitations. Long-form interviews recorded for cable networks and, increasingly, for online platforms offered space to speak at greater length than courtroom testimony allowed. In those settings, the tight constraints of the witness stand loosened. Instead of answering only the specific questions of a prosecutor, he could shape his narrative, explaining not just what he had done, but how he understood it in retrospect. The tone remained matter of fact. He spoke in the same measured voice that had once impressed agents and jurors, avoiding theatrics, offering dates and names with the practiced precision of someone used to having every detail challenged. Viewers who stumbled across these interviews encountered not a snarling caricature of a mobster, but an aging man who alternated between blunt admissions and careful self-examination. He described, in plain terms, how collections worked, how envelopes were passed at Christmas as a way of disguising routine payments, how a contractor might initially resist and then decide that going along was simply the cost of doing business. He did not romanticize any of it. The stories tended to end not with triumph, but with someone under indictment, a business crippled by legal bills, or a family fraying under pressure. At the same time, the very fact that he was willing to talk, and able to talk in such depth, made him a lightning rod. Among the small but vocal set of men still loyal to the old code, his public presence was an ongoing offense. For them, the sin was not only that he had testified, it was that he now spoke about that life on camera, sometimes for audiences that treated his words as a form of entertainment. To critics inside that world, there was something especially galling about a former captain using the notoriety of his cooperation as a platform. They saw no difference between a documentary that tried to contextualize his story and a sensationalized program that played up the most lurid details. In their eyes, he was simply prolonging the life of a story that should have ended, for him, in silence. He was aware of that reaction and occasionally addressed it directly. In some interviews, when asked about the ethics of speaking publicly, he drew a line between what he viewed as truth-telling and glorification. He said he had no interest in trumpeting himself as a tough guy or in dwelling on episodes that might thrill viewers. Instead, he framed his participation as a chance to counter myths, both those spun by Hollywood and those promoted by some former insiders seeking to burnish their own images. He pointed out, for example, that much of the actual work of a captain involved bookkeeping, negotiation, and constant worry over law enforcement scrutiny, rather than the dramatic confrontations that dominated films and television. In those same conversations, he increasingly emphasized the damage he had seen up close. He spoke about construction companies that had gone bankrupt under the weight of corrupt demands, about workers whose pension funds were quietly drained by deals they never voted on, about small business owners who lived for years in fear of what might happen if they refused a demand. He reminded audiences that when a mob-backed company fixed bids on a public project, the inflated costs did not vanish into the ether. They showed up in taxpayers' bills and in fewer resources for schools, hospitals, and basic services. The victims of his crimes in that telling were not just rival mobsters or faceless institutions, but ordinary people whose names would never appear in any indictment. His own family remained an ever-present, if mostly off-camera, part of that reckoning. By his own account, relationships with his children were complicated but enduring. They had grown up in the long shadow of his choices, first the unspoken hints of his criminal life, then the shock of his arrest and incarceration, then the upheaval of witness protection and its aftermath. In later years, he spoke of trying to be more open with them about his past, answering hard questions they posed about why he had done what he did, and acknowledging the ways in which they had paid for decisions they never had a hand in making. He did not pretend that apologies could erase formative years marked by upheaval, but he seemed determined, within the limits of circumstance, to be present for them as an older man in a way he had often failed to be when they were young. The generational distance between him and his children highlighted another shift. For them, the life was not an alluring mystery just beyond the corner storefront. It was a set of court dates, newspaper headlines, and careful moves under assumed names. Many of the social conditions that had once made organized crime seem like a viable path: tight ethnic enclaves, limited legitimate opportunities, neighborhood admiration of connected men, had loosened by the time they reached adulthood. Their ambitions and frames of reference were shaped less by social clubs and more by the broader, more fluid culture of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. If there was a lesson in their choices, it was that the environment capable of producing a Mikey Scars was not simply a matter of individual will. It arose from a particular historical mix of economics, culture, and geography that had, by degrees, changed. Law enforcement officials watching his later interviews drew their own lessons. For agents and prosecutors who had devoted careers to dismantling the mafia's grip on certain sectors, his trajectory validated some of their core strategies. The long-term use of RICO to target criminal enterprises rather than isolated acts, the cultivation of high-level cooperators willing to decode complex financial and organizational structures, and the focus on corrupt intersections between crime families and legitimate industries had, over time, produced tangible results. The Gambino family, while not erased, no longer resembled the juggernaut it had been when he was inducted in 1988. Yet his story also reminded them of the limits of formal victories. Even as the traditional Cosa Nostra declined, other criminal organizations, often transnational in scope, moved into some of the spaces it had occupied. Sophisticated cybercrime syndicates, drug cartels, and freelance fraud networks exploited global financial systems in ways that would have been unimaginable to the men who held court in Brooklyn social clubs in the 1960s. The basic tension remained. Wherever law enforcement pressure squeezed one form of organized crime, new forms adapted to fill demand for illegal services and to prey on systemic vulnerabilities. The challenge, as some officials candidly admitted, was to carry forward the institutional memory encoded in stories like his without treating the defeat of one structure as the end of the broader problem. Public reaction to his presence in the media varied widely. Some viewers, especially those focused on criminal justice reform and victims' perspectives, found it difficult to accept that a man who had played a significant role in corrupting vital economic sectors could now earn any attention at all as a storyteller. To them, the fact that he had cooperated did not erase earlier harms. They worried that even a carefully contextualized presentation risked glamorizing his past simply by making him a recurring character in popular culture. Others, including some from the neighborhoods where he had grown up, expressed a more ambivalent interest. They were drawn to his accounts precisely because they complicated the simplified versions of the mob story they had absorbed over decades. They heard in his voice both pride in having once wielded power and a sustained undercurrent of regret. For his part, he seemed resigned to the fact that he would remain a contested figure. No amount of cooperation or contrition could return him to the moral blank slate of a man who had never entered the life. Nor could public disapproval undo the extensive help he had provided to the government in dismantling key elements of Gambino influence. He occupied an uneasy space between categories that society likes to keep separate: offender and helper, participant and whistleblower, cautionary tale and source of inside knowledge. That ambiguity was, in a sense, the final legacy of the choices he had made starting as a young man on Brooklyn streets. As he aged, physical frailty added another layer of perspective. Law enforcement veterans often note how many of the men they once tracked and prosecuted end up dying not in shootouts or dramatic prison uprisings, but of the same conditions that afflict any aging population: heart disease, cancer, the slow wearing down of the body. By his late 60s and early 70s, Michael was part of that gray-haired cohort, men whose pasts were filled with underworld intrigue but whose present revolved around doctors' appointments, family events, and the everyday concerns of retirement. The contrast between his earlier life, marked by constant movement, always looking for advantage or danger, and his later routines only sharpened his sense that the stakes had not been worth it. In quieter moments, when cameras were not rolling and no interviewer was pressing him for a soundbite, he sometimes framed his story in almost moral philosophical terms. Coming of age in a particular time and place, he had accepted as natural a set of assumptions: that loyalty to one's immediate circle trumped obligations to strangers, that bending or breaking the law was acceptable if it served that circle, that the institutions on the other side of the courtroom, judges, juries, prosecutors, were adversaries to be outwitted, not representatives of a broader public good. It had taken decades, long stretches of isolation, and a radical break with his own code for him to see how narrow that worldview had been. The tragedy, as he presented it, was not only in the damage done to others, but in the wasted potential of men who might, under different circumstances, have applied their energy and intelligence to more constructive ends. His narrative also underscored the fragility of trust in any system built on secrecy and fear. The Gambino family functioned for so long because its members believed, or chose to believe, that the organization would ultimately protect them if they protected it. For a time, in certain respects, that belief was fulfilled. Legal costs were covered, families received support, reputations were honored. But as law enforcement pressure mounted and resources dwindled, that protective circle shrank. Men who had been assured that they would never be left behind found themselves bearing disproportionate burdens. In that environment, the same self-interest that had once led them to demand payments from others led some, like Michael, to shift their loyalties when the structure around them faltered. If his life carried a message for institutions beyond organized crime, it was this: systems that rely on unquestioning loyalty and informal promises, without transparent mechanisms of accountability, are always vulnerable to collapse from within. The mafia's recourse to codes of honor and ritual oaths could not, in the end, withstand the pressures of long prison terms, financial seizure, and changing social expectations. When the gap between what the organization demanded and what it delivered grew too wide, the very men who had embodied its power began to step forward as witnesses against it. The courtroom image that had framed a pivotal moment in his story, the older man, no longer sleek in custom suits, raising his hand to swear an oath he had once mocked in private, became, in retrospect, a kind of emblem for a whole era. He represented a bridge between generations, mentored by figures who had come of age when mafia power was at its height, then serving as a key source for the government at a time when that power was being systematically dissected and diminished. His testimony, preserved in transcripts and recordings, would outlive him, available to future historians and investigators long after the last of his contemporaries were gone. By the early 2020s, the neighborhoods where his path had begun were almost unrecognizable compared to the world he had described on the stand. Many of the old storefront social clubs had been replaced by cafes, boutiques, and apartments catering to a more transient, less tightly knit population. New immigrants from a variety of countries had joined the mix in areas that had once been almost uniformly Italian-American. Young people walked past corners that had once been staked out by Gambino lookouts, absorbed in phones that connected them to a global culture of music, fashion, and information. For most of them, the names that had loomed so large in his youth, Gambino, Genovese, Colombo, were, at most, vague references in movies or true crime podcasts. Standing at that distance, his own younger self might have been almost as hard for him to recognize as the city had become. The boy trailing after older cousins, the young husband drawn into Delacroce's circle through marriage, the ambitious associate learning to maneuver in construction and unions, all those figures existed now mainly as memories sharpened by repeated retellings. The man who lived with the consequences of their choices had white hair, lined features, and an acute awareness of how quickly a life that once seemed set on a single track could veer in unexpected directions. In the end, his story does not resolve neatly into redemption or condemnation. It offers instead a long, complicated arc across 6 decades of American urban history, from the post-war years when organized crime seemed embedded in the fabric of certain neighborhoods, through the high-profile prosecutions and televised trials of the 1980s and 1990s, into a 21st century in which the old families have faded but the questions they raise about power, loyalty, and accountability remain. Michael "Mikey" Scars DiLeonardo moved through all those phases as participant, defendant, witness, and, finally, commentator. The same qualities that once made him valuable to a criminal enterprise, his memory, his ability to read people, his skill in managing complex networks, later made him valuable to the institutions that sought to understand and dismantle that enterprise. For those who study that period, his life serves as both source and symbol. As a source, because his detailed accounts help fill gaps in the record, allowing investigators and historians to see how decisions announced in headlines were rooted in years of quieter maneuvering. As a symbol, because he embodies the tensions and contradictions at the heart of organized crime in America, its reliance on family and tradition, its exploitation of aspiration and grievance, its ultimate incompatibility with a society governed by transparent rules rather than private arrangements. However one judges him, his path from Brooklyn sidewalks to the witness stand, and finally to the subdued anonymity of later life, marks a trajectory that mirrors the rise and decline of the world he once called his own.